Nagato is an interesting character. Like all Naruto villains, he seems to just be a poor kid that lost his way and gave in to the Shinobi world's cruelty and was changed by it. Nagato wasn't always special. He became known as the third sage of six paths, but let's be honest, this wasn't because he was anything special. His Rinnegan were a loan from Madara, and the poor boy couldn't even use them to their full potential. But despite that, he still leveled Konoha like a boot squashing a bug, and was only taken out because Naruto is the hero. But Nagato's fall to the dark side really was started by the death of Yahiko, the man he looked up to the most. But Yahiko didn't ever truly have to die. This was a selfless choice he made, and he used Nagato as a vector for that to hopefully satiate Hanzo's cravings for cruelty. So let's just take a moment to think about what might have happened had Yahiko, for some reason, not been killed on that day. Welcome to the Amagi. Before we begin, we publish a new video every day, so be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. We've noticed that a lot of the people watching our videos aren't actually subscribed to our channels, and if you have been enjoying them, we would absolutely love it if you hit that subscribe button. Thanks so much. The Amagi's reach stretches beyond just this channel, so if you're a fan of us, please consider subscribing to our other channels and following us on all of our social media. Help us reach our goal of passing 100,000 followers on all of our accounts by the end of the year. The rain was falling as it always did. The rain never let up. It always just kept pounding the ground eternally, washing away blood like some metaphor for something larger. But today, nobody gave a damn about metaphors. Right now, they were in the middle of bloodshed, or perhaps caught just before bloodshed. Looking up at him on his perch high above, Nagato and Yahiko watched as Hanzo held Konan by the throat. Konan would normally dodge these things. Her paper-style jutsu made it hard to ever pin her down, but this was unexpected. After all, Hanzo had never been their enemy. In fact, he was their idol, and now that she was caught, there was nothing that could be done. It would take too long for her to reduce her body to paper and escape. No, the moment she made even a little movement, Hanzo would kill her. This was also true for Yahiko and Nagato. There was no way to save her. They tried a lot of things, begging, pleading, stroking his ego, confessing their admiration. Nothing really seemed to change the old legend's mind. He didn't really seem all too interested in their platitudes as they attempted to explain their noble goals and desires. Really, all they truly were to him was a threat, and he had already determined in his own mind that they all would die. The only question now was how? What way would be most pleasurable? What would make them hurt the most and really drive home the fear? How could he make them feel that every terror and bad expectation that they could possibly have undersold the reality of what they were facing? He thought about it. Ritualistic suicide is what his mind settled on. Oh, how beautiful. The concept that by sacrificing one's life, all others would be saved. And what's better than that, he would make the other do it. Yahiko was their leader, so he should be the first to die. And he should do it by the hands of his friend. That's what he told them. He told them that Yahiko should die. "Hurry up, or do you want this woman to die?" he shouted to them. Yahiko turned to him and told him simply that he should kill him. Nagato was confused as to why the one man they respected the most, even above Jiraiya, was going to make them kill each other just because they were helping him protect his village. Nagato reached down and picked up a kunai. He looked at the iron blade. There was nothing special about it. It was not designed to be made of anything that could never rust. These were designed to be disposable, just like them. The Akatsuki were now disposable to Hanzo, and right now Hanzo was disposing of them like a used kunai. He looked over. "Yahiko!" Suddenly, Yahiko rushed him and pushed his body up against Nagato so that his friend wouldn't have the chance to refuse stabbing him. Nagato was shocked, and Konan called out Yahiko's name. Yahiko lay his head on Nagato's shoulder, expectant that the blood might begin to pour from his perforated bowels, but it never came up. Yahiko looked down and realized that Nagato was holding his kunai in reverse grip. The only thing that Yahiko had touched of the kunai was its rounded loop where one would put their finger for leverage. "Nagato!" Yahiko shouted out, as if angry that Nagato had somehow thwarted his attempt in a premeditated fashion. Nagato was speechless. Whatever nerve he had built up at this point was gone from the shock of the failed attempt. He stumbled back, stuttering over his own words. Hanzo looked down. "Well, do it! Kill him!" Nagato looked at the blade in his hand, and in terror and disgust, he discarded it. "Nagato!" Yahiko cried out as he saw him throw the kunai away. Hanzo rolled his eyes. Fine, then we'll do it this way then. He drove his blade through Conan's chest, twisting the blade and sawing about with it just to make sure it hurt, just to make sure that he hit the vital organs. Putting his foot in the small of her back, he kicked her off the blade and down the steep incline toward the ground where the body tumbled and bounced along the path before smashing into the ground. Yahiko saw this, as did Nagato. Yahiko ran over toward Conan and held her up. She cried out, her bones broken from the fall. With her one good arm, she gripped out at the wound as if she could somehow stop it from bleeding. Yahiko cried out to her, "Conan!" She gurgled and tried to say something, but what it was, Yahiko couldn't hear. She tried once more, and it almost sounded like she said, "Help me." She coughed as a spurt of blood ejected from her mouth. She wheezed 3 times before her eyes glazed, and she started to fall against Yahiko. Her arms and legs twitched momentarily before all movement left her body. Her eyes remained open, but there was nobody home. No light. Yahiko had seen this before. You could stare directly into the eyes of someone like this and just know that no one was looking back. Nagato crawled over. Conan. He witnessed the husk left behind and felt as if it was his fault. But if he had killed Yahiko, what guarantee was there that any of them would survive? And if he would have still lost a friend? He had merely been given the cruel choice of deciding which of his friends would die, and today it was Conan. Nagato hated himself for his weakness and knew for certain that Yahiko would hate him for it too. He gripped his dark cloak and grit his teeth. He hated it. He hated the situation, he hated himself, but above all other things, he hated Hanzo. He looked up at him, every glance cursing his soul, every breath uttering death and pain, as if he were chanting some ancient spell that would inflict the pains of hell upon this man. Hanzo was not a hero. Hanzo was a creature. He was an animal to be hunted for sport and then wasted as if his life never mattered. And in Nagato's eyes, it never did. He so callously disposed of his best friend, and now Nagato would dispose of Hanzo like garbage, like trash, like nothing. All the while, Hanzo looked deep into the eyes of Nagato and immediately felt the killing intent. And what was worse, he felt that Nagato had the power to do it too. Even Danzo, upon seeing this, suddenly disappeared in a puff of smoke. Hanzo commanded his men to fire their kunai down at Nagato, but Nagato lifted his hand and the kunai bounced away from him, as if being struck by some invisible barrier that protected him. Nagato would then rush them, but a fire-style jutsu would cause massive damage to his legs. Despite being set ablaze, Nagato stood resolute. No pain could compare to the loss of Conan, so anything they did to his body was a pale echo. He hoped that he could teach them some semblance of pain, anything close to what he felt. His Rinnegan opened wide, so wide that they seemed almost as if they might fall out of his head, and from them a silent call went out, a whisper. From the ground, 2 hands shot up. Pulling itself from the earth like an undead revenant pulled from death by some necromancer, the ghetto statue appeared. But it would have its toll. Chakra rods extended from the creature and buried themselves in the back of Nagato, where they would then begin to siphon out his chakra. Nagato cried out, but the ghetto statue, as if it were the devil summoned up to forge a deal for his soul, began to fulfill their contract and effortlessly slaughter everyone. A chakra dragon shot out from its mouth. It passed through the air and overtook the bodies of those nearby, pulling their souls from their forms and devouring them as if it were nothing. Hanzo, seeing this, fled just as Danzo previously had, leaving his men to die. The other men fled, crying out in terror, but nothing could save them. They were fish in a barrel, and Nagato was holding the biggest shotgun in the world. Eventually, all fell quiet. The statue quit moving, and Nagato just lay there, his knees hardly above the ground, his legs not even trying to stand, his entire body dangling by the rods buried in his back. Yahiko rushed over to check on him. Nagato's eyes remained open, and though there was light in them, there was no consciousness. Yahiko tried to pull Nagato from the rods, but his eyes suddenly blinked and he screamed out in pain. The rods weren't going anywhere. Realizing this, Yahiko took his blade, the tip removed in a symbolic disavowal of violence, and used it to shatter the rods so that Nagato might fall into his arms. "I have you, Nagato. I have you." Years later, after endless civil war, Hanzo finds himself on the ground. He looks up in horror to find the one who bested him, a woman with purple hair and Rinnegan-patterned eyes. Across her body were what appeared to be various piercings, but in reality were the way in which she was remotely controlled. By her side, 5 other beings stood, each with their hair dyed purple, possessing the same Rinnegan markings in their eyes. Yahiko stood in the background, his gaze only out of the corner of his eye as he watched this unfold. His face's angle suggested shame, but he would not step in to help, no matter how hard Hanzo begged. No, instead he sat there and watched. These 6 figures, each one a pale imitation of the girl he had killed so many years earlier, showed him no mercy. Violently and gruesomely, they killed Hanzo. Once the deed was done, they turned to leave. Yahiko spoke. "Should we at least bury him?" Pain, from the persona of Conan, turned to look at him. "He is trash. Let him fester and rot like trash." The 6 paths walked out of the building. Yahiko took one look at the body and then turned to follow them. In these past years, Yahiko had lost complete control of Nagato, of the Akatsuki as a whole. He had originally given over the Akatsuki to Nagato as Yahiko had blood on his hands from an accidental killing years prior. But now that blood was everywhere and Nagato was drowning in it. Years of civil war had turned a peacekeeping group into a war-waging one. They had gone from a private security force and ambassadorial group into a mercenary unit hell-bent on taking over the Hidden Rain village, and now they had. They just had. With the head of the village removed and what little of his forces remaining scattered in the face of them, Nagato was, for better or worse, the new dictator of Amagakure. He returned to their base to see Nagato. He was a cold shell of his former self, pale, bony, and requiring continual life support, all of which held within a mobile unit that used the same concept as a puppet. It looked like a spider that Nagato was riding. Nagato opened his eyes as Yahiko stepped in. He didn't speak or say anything. At this point, Nagato's consciousness was untethered and floating about 7 different bodies. Each one could equally be considered Nagato, or maybe it was just pain now. This Darth Vader-esque fall to darkness had left Nagato unrecognizable. But deep down, he knew that the person Nagato had been was still in there somewhere, and now it was time to bring it back. The war that Yahiko reluctantly agreed to was now over, and there was no need for this weaponized form of Nagato to continue. It was time for the pain to go away, to heal with time and love, to return to Nagato. It was time to beat the swords into plowshares. "Nagato, the war is officially over. What do you plan to do now?" Nagato's spider walked by silently, no words or anything. He was merely walking his way towards Hanzo's tower, the highest point in all of Ame. A point with which he could use his 6 paths across the entire village without much effort. Yahiko walked with him there and helped him get set up and comfortable. Nagato sat there and closed his eyes. Yahiko looked at him as if he thought Nagato were sleeping. Suddenly, beside him, he noticed Conan staring into the back of his head. Yahiko could never get used to this. He turned to Conan. "Nagato, now that the war's over, what do you plan on doing now?" Conan stood there silent for a moment before speaking. "Bring peace to the rest of the world." Yahiko looked out at the partly devastated Ame. This isn't peace, Nagato." Nagato looked out over the site. "It looks like peace to me. No fighting. There will never be fighting here ever again." Yahiko turned to look at him. "That's solely because you have them in a death grip. They're scared of you. This isn't peace, this is fear." Conan's Rinnegan cut to Yahiko. "What's the difference?" Yahiko was startled. "How can anyone enjoy this?" "They can enjoy it because they're still alive. And if they wish to stay that way, they ought to not sabotage this peace, else they'll know the same fate as Hanzo." Yahiko shook his head. "You've been listening to that man, Madara, again." Conan's gaze looked out over the village. "Madara's plans align with mine." "He's controlling you, Nagato," Yahiko shouted. Despite his rise in tone and flailing of arms, Conan did not flinch, nor did her tone shift from Nagato's monotone nature. "He's only in as much control as I allow him. I'm still the leader of this organization." Yahiko sighed. "For how long, though? The issue is, people who are under someone else's control rarely know they are until they've completely lost their own. He's going to make a move eventually and dispose of you. You're only necessary to his plans now. What happens when your usefulness comes to an end?" Conan stood there, silent for a moment. "Likely the same thing that will happen to him when his usefulness comes to an end." Yahiko shook his head. "You truly have changed, Nagato. I've become what the world made me. My desire for peace remains. I've merely become a realist." Yahiko looked to him. "And what does that mean? What does it mean for you to be a realist?" Conan spoke. "I realize that you and I want peace. But the reality of this world is that we're the only ones. Nobody wants peace. Have you noticed how the land of fire, wind, lightning, water, and earth fund their nations? Through their hidden villages. These villages are the heart and soul of these kingdoms, And what is one resource each village predominantly brings to the table? Shinobi. Soldiers. The economy of our world is supported by war. A war economy. Weapons manufacturers create tools for shinobi. Shinobi buy food and items for war. Villages send shinobi to war and send them out on mercenary missions to make money. The entire world system is held up by war. Nobody wants peace because peace is linked in their minds to poverty, while war is linked to a life of plenty. And all go to war to chase their dreams. Standard shinobi wish to become Kage by proving themselves. Blood has become the currency of this world, and so long as war is profitable, it will continue to be waged. Nobody wants peace, and because of that, peace will never come unless we shove it down their throats. Yahiko stood there and looked out over the village once more. He understood every word that was spoken was true, but then again, he couldn't accept that. I refuse to believe that, Nagato. I refuse to believe that people don't want peace. I've seen shinobi fight and die, begging for it. Conan took a deep breath. It wasn't like this body needed to breathe, but this was done from habit. Perhaps not. But then again, what will simple shinobi do? They're duty-bound, bound by honor, by patriotism. The shinobi who fight the war come to learn how bad war is. They see what it looks like and hate it, searching for peace instead. But the difference is, those who initiate war, those who invite it and send the warriors out, never see it themselves. They simply do not know war. They do not know pain. And it's because of that, war will never end. War at its worst must be experienced by all for peace to become an option. I understand your reluctance, Yahiko. After all, you and I know pain. But until the world knows it, it cannot know peace. This gray area must become a well-defined line. War or peace. Nothing in between. No ceasefires. Only the peace treaty to end all peace treaties. We must indulge in the business of war to end war as a business. This is the only way. Yahiko grunted as he realized he was getting nowhere. He was unsure if he could ever change Nagato's mind on this, and since he couldn't change Nagato's mind, he would have to keep an eye out on him and possibly even sabotage him if it came down to it. What Nagato was planning to do would cause the deaths of countless people. The path to peace should not be paved with blood like this, not in Yahiko's eyes, and so he kept his eyes open. The first thing to do was to keep an eye on this Madara fellow. He was the one who spoke of the tailed beasts. He was the one who told Nagato that he could absorb them with the Geto statue. It was obvious that he knew far more than he let on, and so he would wait until the next meeting of the Akatsuki, the next face-to-face meeting between him and Pain. It's time we begin operations, Pain would say. We now have the proper manpower and the proper funding to begin this project. Toby, in the guise of Madara's voice, would speak. Having tracked most of the tailed beasts to their targets, I've compiled a list of targets and which to strike first. The Jinchuriki of the Five Tails, Han of Iwagakure, is currently living on his own away from the village and should be an easy target. Pain thought about this deeply for a moment and nodded. Then he is the first target. I'll issue the order to bring Han to me, then we'll remove his five tails and place it within the statue. Madara nodded his head to this and turned to leave. Before he does, however, he's bumped into by Yahiko. Pardon me, Yahiko, Toby says in the voice of Madara. Yahiko holds out a hand to stop him from moving past, and suddenly the air in the room changes. Yahiko looks to Madara. What are you up to, Madara? Without even moving his head to face Yahiko, he speaks. Whatever do you mean, Yahiko? Yahiko turns his head to look straight into that orange mask. What are you doing to Nagato? What's your plan? What do you get out of this? And what happens to Nagato when you're done? Finally, Toby turns to face him. Plan? My only plan is to bring peace. I share yours and Nagato's goal. That is what I get out of it. Peace. And I do not plan to do anything to Pain. He and I share a common goal. To work against him is to work against myself. At any point, Toby could have phased through Yahiko's arm, but he didn't. This was a different sort of battle entirely. By not phasing through, he was not running. He could easily show off his Kamui in an attempt to intimidate Yahiko, but nothing in his mind could be more intimidating than not phasing through. Because in remaining tangible, he was sending a message. A message that said he did not need to phase through Yahiko because he was not threatened by him. All the while, Yahiko kept his hand on Toby's chest, his eyes fixated on that single visible Sharingan. The long moment of silence had become a mental battle to display dominance, and the prize was Nagato. Even to a point, Pain turned to look to see what was happening between the two of them. Yahiko was keeping his eyes on Toby to counter as if saying, "You don't scare me at all." They continued to stand like this until Pain looked to them and commanded them to break apart. Taking the order, Yahiko held his hand there for 3 more seconds. Each of those seconds, his eyes filled to the brim with more determination than he had displayed in the entirety of their conversation. He then removed his hand and let Toby walk on and disappear into his kamui as he tended to do when he was done speaking. Pain took a look at Yahiko, and Yahiko looked up once to meet Pain's gaze before the two of them looked away. All the while, Yahiko fought the urge to smile, knowing that he had just tagged Madara, and right now he'd be able to easily find his location. As the day wound down and Yahiko was given leave to do as he pleased, Yahiko would end up teleporting to just outside the area, where he would find himself near an abandoned mineshaft. He would ease his way in where he hoped to uncover any or all of this Madara's secrets. As he made his way deeper into the mine, he found it as just that, a mine. But as he went deeper, he found old roots. Following these routes, he would eventually find himself sneaking into a facility that seemed more for military use than the mineshaft had. Skulking about, he eventually found himself walking through a corridor of various rooms with various supplies and weapons. Then he stepped into a room. The moment his presence was detected by a sensor, the lights automatically came on. This caused Yahiko to jump ever so slightly. Seeing that there was no threat, he took a look around and realized what he was witnessing was a room filled with medical tools, and walls packed from floor to ceiling with jars containing what appeared to be preserved Sharingan. Yahiko looked around at this. He had never seen a repository of dojutsu this large. He knew very little of how dojutsu worked outside of what he had learned from Nagato, but he did know one thing. Sharingan had the ability to mutate into Mangekyo Sharingan when enough stress was added, and even if a quarter of these Sharingan had the ability to become Mangekyo, given how hacks they could be from the stories he heard, this could possibly make Madara the most powerful man in the entirety of not only Konoha, but perhaps the entirety of the world. These gave him options, both militarily and politically, as Sharingan and their various uses could be used to cast genjutsu and other mind-altering techniques on politicians and people of power. He almost wondered if it were possible that such a genjutsu could have been cast over Nagato. That would explain his odd conviction to a plan that Yahiko viewed to be illogical. Well, illogical was a stretch, but at the very least uncharacteristic. Simply the knowledge that this was here was enough. So long as he wasn't detected, merely returning to Nagato with this knowledge might be enough to snap him out of it. He stepped out of the room, which caused the lights to go out a little while after. He continued to sneak through. He would eventually find himself in a room where there was a massive bud. It seemed as if it were closed now, but it was still alive to the best of his knowledge. The roots had all led Yahiko here to this room. He walked up to the flower and took a good look at it. Below it there appeared to be water, and submerged in that water he could see something. He stepped to the crevice and sniffed. He was hoping to make sure that what he was actually sniffing was really water. And once he was sure it was water, he decided to take a dip to find out what was down there. As he began to swim, he saw what appeared to be cocoons under the water. His curiosity got the better of him, so he got closer to the nearest cocoon and placed his hands on it to take a look. He had no idea what it was, but it didn't seem to be booby-trapped. So he placed his hands on the flaps and began to pull until he could open it up. Within the cocoon, he discovered, to his horror, a person. But this person did not appear to be made of the same flesh he was. No, far from it. He was made solely of some white substance that almost put him in the mind of tofu. He almost screamed and lost all of his oxygen when he saw it, but he maintained his composure. Slowly, its eyes opened and looked directly into his. Yahiko floated there as their eyes made contact. He did the only thing he could think of to do. He reached out with his hand and touched its forehead to cast a genjutsu to put the thing to sleep. He then tried his best to close the cocoon back up, though to his own self-admission, the thing wouldn't really stay closed. So he gave up on it. He swam back to the surface of the water and gripped the roots of the large flower and began to haul himself back up. Once he was out of the water, he released a quick burst of pressure via his chakra to instantaneously dry him off. He continued to walk through the base. It was obvious that this Madara fellow was planning something a bit more than just gathering all the tailed beasts. Perhaps this could be used in service to Nagato, sure. But if it was planned to be used that way, he would have informed Nagato about it sooner. He continued to move about until he heard what sounded like voices in the distance. He began to make his way closer. Peeking around the corner, he witnessed Madara speaking to another that was revealed to be Zetsu. It was then that Yahiko made the connection that this Akatsuki member was likely the same as those creatures growing underwater. They were speaking about something, the Ten Tails and the Eye of the Moon plan. Yahiko's mind began to connect dots, and he remembered that they let this man decide who would be put into the ranks of the Akatsuki. Yahiko was mortified to realize at this point that the Akatsuki that he had formed years prior was no longer his own, but Madara's. He had moved right in, manipulated his way to the top, and was now the one in full control of the Akatsuki, and the only person who could stand in his way was Nagato. He needed him for some reason. As he listened to the two of them talk, he realized that it was Nagato's Rinnegan. Nagato was the only one capable of controlling the demonic statue of the Outer Path, and that they required his cooperation to revive the Ten Tails. He was a figurehead, and the only thing that could fulfill their wishes. That was why they needed him, and that was what they were doing to manipulate Nagato. Yahiko turned to leave, but suddenly found himself face to face with the Zetsu from earlier. He let out a terrified gasp that, to his terror, echoed across the room, catching the attention of Black Zetsu and Toby. As it stood there, the Zetsu was passive, just staring at him, as if it knew he wasn't supposed to be there, yet debating whether it should raise an alarm due to this man being one of their group and technically having possible clearance to be here. Yahiko believed he might be able to slip right by it, but the moment Toby called out for whoever was out there to show themselves, the Zetsu gripped Yahiko's throat and carried him out into the open. Madara approached him and gave him a sigh of disappointment. Ah, Yahiko, why did you have to do that? Black Zetsu approached from behind him. He's seen and heard too much. We can't allow him to leave. Madara thought about this for a moment. If he suddenly disappears, Pain will grow suspicious. This man is the last thing on Earth that Pain truly cares about. If he were to go missing, especially after this afternoon, Pain would more than likely confront me, and his cooperation would be at an end. Black Zetsu's one golden eye looked at Madara as his other white half lay dormant under its counterpart's control. What should we do then? Toby put his hand on Yahiko's head and invaded his mind with the power of the Sharingan. He glazed over all the information that he thought he might need and then placed his hand on Zetsu's head and commanded it to transform into an exact replica of Yahiko. We simply replaced the real Yahiko with one that we can control. He looked to the Zetsu and then to Yahiko and gave the command, lock him away. The Zetsu turned and began to walk away with Yahiko toward the brig. Toby returned his attention to Zetsu, and the two of them continued their talk on the matter. The Five Tails will soon be in our possession. That will be the beginning of our plot. Toby nodded. All we need to do is make sure that Pain remains under our control by any means necessary. It is he, after all, that will be used to revive the true Madara from the dead. Pain, in the form of Conan, sat down upon the tongue of the statue that had at one time been their base. He, or should I say she, right now, stood and walked into the statue, deeper into their old hideout. Pain may have become the living embodiment of a concept, and perhaps his views had changed quite a bit, but he was still a human and was still capable of nostalgia. He walked through and found the table where their members used to sit around and play cards. He recalled the day when the Akatsuki was reborn. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, Nagato was killed and Pain born in his place. Through the ashes of love and brotherhood, hatred and despair were given rise to. He wondered what it would have been like had Hanzo merely accepted them. What if Hanzo had simply agreed that they were doing good work and went through with his promise to let them mediate the various sides during the war? Fond memories rushed back to him, which almost caused him to smile. But as he walked deeper, he found the personal quarters that had been his own. It was mostly empty except for a few mementos. Pain had always been a sentimental type. That's why he was as he is now. His sentimentality had been transformed into a weapon to be used against not only himself but others. This world was cruel and unforgiving. Should peace be any less cruel? He stepped past it and into Yahiko's room, which was the exact opposite of his. It was filled to the brim with knickknacks, dirty laundry, and discarded snack packages, all of which had haired over with mold and cockroaches in the time since the end of the first generation of the Akatsuki. It stank in there. Pain wondered if this room itself could be used as some biological weapon against their enemies. He was certain to close this door particularly as he walked out. Finally, he made his way into Conan's room. Her room was almost as bare as Pain's. The bed neatly made, the clothes were all in their proper compartments. The mementos Conan held were not too dissimilar from those that Nagato held, but it had been obvious that she favored Yahiko of the two of them. There were more items here from Yahiko than there had been of Nagato. Conan had always had a deep crush on Yahiko, and it had always been Nagato's belief that Yahiko reciprocated, but that the both of them were far too nervous to mention it to the other. He sat on her bed and looked at the picture frame sitting lovingly by the bedside table. It was a picture of the three of them and Jiraiya, all together. Such simple times. But times before that were hard. They didn't know if they'd survive. They were living day to day, and yet they had each other. The love in their hearts filled their bellies, and on the occasions when they would eat whatever slop they had scrounged together, whatever it was, so long as they ate it together, it felt like a feast, like the best meal in the world. When Jiraiya came, they developed into a true family, and it was the first time that Pain had ever felt as if he were a member of a greater family since the Second Shinobi World War had claimed his parents. Despite no longer starving and having enough food, Pain felt as if he were just barely hanging on to life. Technically, this was true. But one thing that was true was that he had no true internal damage. Yes, these rods were passing through his back, but it dealt no damage to his digestive system. He could eat if he wanted to, and perhaps even gain back the weight he once had, but he didn't. Why? Simply because he did not want to. Meals were empty now. Perhaps he had access to the greatest delicacies that Amagakure had to offer, but he had no taste in them. Not since... He stood and looked at the mirror hanging above the sink that Konan had near her bed. He saw her face, riddled with chakra rods. What had once been a simple piercing in her bottom lip that she had received voluntarily because she was feeling wild that day had suddenly turned into a porcupine of black rods through her nose and ears. Looking into this mirror, he could almost feel Konan judging him, as if she felt disgusted that her body was being defiled by pain. Opening the jacket, he noted that the hole in her chest was still there. How symbolic. The secret that Nagato had held on to for all these years was a simple one. He, like Yahiko, had fallen in love with Konan, but he'd said nothing to her. After all, he had known that Yahiko had been in love with her first, and dared not make a move against his best friend. But as he looked back, he wondered what would have happened if he said anything at all. Maybe if he had, she might still be alive. Pain believed in peace. He had no other choice to now. It was all he was clinging to. He felt that if he ever forgot about peace, he would lose his drive to live and would simply fade away. But before, he hadn't really cared as much about war or peace. Not like Yahiko had. Nagato had been a blank slate, believing only in what he was told by Yahiko. All he wanted was a family, people to love and be loved by. If he had told Konan before, maybe they would have forsaken what now seemed like a pointless goal. Maybe she would still be here, and the three of them would be living safely somewhere else. But hesitation gave rise to loss, and from that, Pain had learned a valuable lesson. If there was something you wanted, you took it without hesitation, because the longer you waited to act, the riskier it became, the closer to losing it you became. That was why Pain had vowed to himself that if ever one day he wanted something, he would take it and no one would stop him. And right now, he wanted to achieve his goals. And his singular goal was peace through war, and nobody would take that away from him. And I think it's safe to end this story right here for now. I had quite a blast making this one. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. It was unique to follow a story in which it was Konan who died. To be able to jump deeply into Pain's philosophy and how it clashed with Yahiko's was a breath of fresh air. To see the wedge driven between two friends and to flesh out the humanity of Pain right there at the end, it felt perfect. I truly hope that you all enjoyed it. Leave a comment below to tell me your thoughts and your favorite parts of the video. Until next time, my friends. Peace.
Did you enjoy our video? Well, then be sure to check out these other great videos from the Amagi, and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos.